Chapter 3 Towards Manassas. He thought he would remember the train ride forever. Most of the men had never been on a train, and certainly few of them had been on one this plush. The seats were soft and cushiony, and the food, especially compared to the rough fare at Fort Snelling, was delicious. They rode across Wisconsin and down into Chicago, and everywhere they stopped there were huge crowds gathered to cheer them on. Girls gave them hankies and sweets, and Charlie figured later he had fallen in love at least a dozen times. The country didn't change much at first, and it was still a union. They made their way, sleeping like lords and eating like kings, Charlie thought, across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and down into Maryland, and there were crowds all the way, even when the train didn't stop. Charlie saw his first coloreds when they moved into Maryland. They looked poor and had poor clothes, and he thought about slavery then, and how it must be strange to own a person, so they had to do what you wanted. He'd never considered it before and wondered what would happen after the war when the Union had whipped the rebels. Would they be allowed to keep their slaves? The war wasn't initially about slavery. The troops were going to stop the lawbreakers and wrong thinkers that were trying to bust up the Union. They talked about it at night while the train moved east and south, and never did they speak of slavery, just about the wrong-headedness of the Southern crackers and how they had to teach Johnny Reb a lesson. A woman of color came up to him when the train was stopped in Maryland just before Baltimore and handed him a sweet roll and said, "Thank you for what you're doing. I hope God keeps you safe from harm and brings you back to your family." She was crying. Charlie thanked her and ate the cake and smiled at her and wondered why she was crying and wanted to ask why she was glad he was going to fight the South. She was, after all, part of the South, but they had to reboard the train then, and he never found out why the colored woman was crying. He did see as the train moved off that a white woman came out of the house and grabbed the colored woman by her dress and dragged her back inside. Then she turned and shook her fist at the train. She's a Reb, he thought, and it surprised him, though he didn't know why he should be surprised that a woman who owned another person would be a Reb. They were in Maryland and had been warned to watch out for rebels and their sympathizers, but it was still his first experience with a Southerner. He watched the houses from the open window as the train pulled away, hoping for another sight of the woman. Now the country was changing. There had been farms all along and towns, but the trees seemed more spaced out here, the pastures more open, and Charlie began to see poor farms. He'd heard the men talking about them, the poor whites, but he still wasn't quite ready for the sight when the train slowed for a hill and passed a shack that was little more than boards tacked to some poles. The children running around out front were only half clothed, and a man and a woman were sitting in rags. All the soldiers talked about the poor white trash and how these were the people they had come to fight, people who couldn't get out of their yards, let alone fight a proper army. It made him very conscious of his own home. Even without a father there, the house was in good shape and kept up, and there was a well-tended garden, good food, clothes that covered bodies. He wondered how the rebels thought they could fight a war when their people couldn't dress themselves. It made him sad to see the children barely clothed. What would happen to them in winter? They did not have much of a winter here, he knew, nothing like Minnesota's, but it would still be cold. He turned from the window just as a man next to him, a private named Swenson, said, "You could throw a cat through their house without hitting a wall." "They don't have anything," Charlie said, "not a thing." The man nodded. "This ain't going to be much of a war. I don't see how they can fight. They don't have any clothes." "Hell, it'll probably be over before we get to Washington," Swenson said, and Charlie nodded but stopped talking because he did not like profanity even of a low order, and there was much of it around. He thought of a surgeon who had spoken to them and told them to try to wear clean clothing going into battle in case they were hit by a rifle ball. If the cloth was carried into the wound, clean cloth would cause less infection. He had thought of it, and taken a bullet from one of the paper cartridges and pushed it against his sleeve. It didn't seem possible that the bullet could be made to go through the sleeve, into him, carrying the fabric with it. He thought it must be the same with profanity and immoral thinking. Charlie believed in heaven and hell and God and Jesus and wanted to be with God if he was killed. If he had profane thoughts as he went to war, they might infect his soul, as the dirty clothes would infect his wound. And while he did not think he would die, did not think he would even be hurt or hit, did not think of it at all, still it was best to be careful. He stared out the window and thought of all the things he would tell his mother and his brother Orrin when he wrote the next letter. "I'm a man now," he would write, "and seeing and doing a man's things out in the world. I've seen things you wouldn't believe." He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the gentle rocking of the train take him to sleep. Permission from the publisher was obtained to record this chapter.